Welcome back to the Python tutorial series. I'm so glad you're here. Today we will learn how to write clean and professional code in Python. First we will go over type hinting, then docstrings, and finally declarative programming. So let's get started. I created a file called typehinting.py and I'm gonna create a function called calculation. And it's gonna have two parameters, x and y. And all I'm going to do is return x plus y all to the power of x. Now if I were to print the calculation of 3 comma 4, it would give me the answer. And when I do this, it gives 343. But we can use type hinting. So we can say x needs to be a float, and it can be a float or an integer. So if we want the type to be one of two things, from the typing module we can import union. Then the first parameter x will either be an integer or a float, and we surround it with union so it knows it's one of the two, and the same thing for y. Now when we input calculation, it knows that x is either an integer or a float. So we'll put 3 and 4 again, and you'll see this arrow at the end, and it says any. What this arrow represents is the output, and it's gonna return either a float or an int, because x plus y to the power of x is either an integer or a float number, depending on what is passed in. So now if I were to enter it again, it's gonna say x is an integer or a float, y is an integer or a float, and the result will be either an integer or a float, and I get 343, which is an integer. So that's the basics of type hinting. Now let's move on to docstrings. I created a file called docstrings.py, and I'm going to create a function called power, and it's going to have two parameters, x and y. And for this example, I'm not going to use type hinting, but I'm going to use docstrings just to show you what it does. So docstrings show what a function or class or something else does. So I'm going to create a function that takes in two numbers. And the first number is the base and the second number is the exponent. So it has two arguments. The first parameter is x and it will be an integer, and I'll say this is the base. And the second, y, is also an integer, and I'll say this is the exponent. And it's gonna return x to the power of y. So I'll just say returns x to the power of y, which is also an integer. And all this function does is return x to the power of y. This is a very simple function, but the purpose of this is to show you what the docstring does. So now I'm going to print power, and when I put open parentheses, you see the docstring, and it's going to say x integer, this is the base. And I'm like, okay, this is the base. And then after the comma y, this is the exponent, and so I'll put 3 and 4. So now when I run this, I get 81, and that's how docstrings work. I created a file called Declarative Programming.py, and I'm going to create a variable called numbers, and I'll set this equal to a list of numbers, and I'll make it a list of 50 numbers starting at 0 and going up to 49. I'm then going to create an empty filtered list and set this equal to an empty list, and then I'll say for number in numbers, if the number is divisible by 3 and the number is divisible by 5, I'm gonna add the number to the end of the filtered list. So I'll do filtered list.append number, and then finally I'll print filtered list. And when I run this, this works, but it's very inefficient and it takes up a lot of lines. We can clean this up using declarative programming. So I'm going to comment these 4 lines of code out, and I'll just create a variable called filtered list, and then I'll set this equal to a list, and then I'll use the filter function, which is faster than iterating through everything. And then in order to say divisible by 3 and divisible by 5, I'm gonna use a lambda function, and it's gonna have a variable x, and all I'll say is if x is divisible by 3 and x is divisible by 5, it should return the result. Now I'm gonna pass it in the original list, which is numbers, and now when I run this, this works and gives the same result, but is much quicker. Now I'm gonna create a list of numbers that are cubed. And like before, I'm not gonna use declarative programming at the start. So I'll set cube equal to an empty list, and then I'll do for number in numbers. If the number is divisible by 10, I'm gonna cube the number and add it to the end of the list. So I'll say cube.append, and then I'll say number to the power of 3. And then finally I'm gonna print cubed. And when I run this, this works, but it's inefficient like before, so I'm gonna comment this out again. I can do this all in one line by creating a variable cubed and setting this equal to a list, and I'll say number to the power of 3 for number in numbers. So this is basically the for loop. At the end I'll say if the number is divisible by 10, and this is much faster than before, and when I run this I get the same result. Now let's combine all the skills that we just learned by putting this into a function. So I'll create a function called filter list power, and it's gonna take 3 parameters. The first, which is power, and it's gonna be an integer. Then I'll say divisor, which will also be an integer. And then the third one is the range, but we can't use the word range because that word is already taken in Python. So instead of that, I'll say number of values, which is also an integer, and it's gonna output a list. The next thing I'll do is create a docstring, and I'll say this takes in a list of a range of numbers starting at 0, and returns a filtered list to a given power for the numbers divisible by the divisor. And the next thing I will do is the arguments. The first one is power, which is an integer, and I'll say the power that it is being raised to. The next one is the divisor, which is also an integer, and I'll say what is checked to see if the number is divisible by. And finally is the number of values, which is also an integer. And this is just the length of the numbers list. And finally, this will return a filtered list, which is of course a list. And I'll just say the list of filtered values. And then this is not necessarily cubed, and then I'll replace cubed with filtered list because this is what it will be returning. And then I'll say number to the power of power for number in numbers, and numbers isn't necessarily 50 anymore. It is the number of values. So I'll switch this to number of values, and it's if the number is divisible by the divisor. So I'll replace that there as well. So now this should work. And then I'm gonna return the filtered list. So when I want to run this and output an answer, I'm gonna print filter list to a power, and then I'll open this, and then the first thing will be a power, and I'll say 3, and the second thing will be a divisor, and I'll say 6 this time, and I'll do 60 numbers. And as you see here, it has the entire docstring, so we can see what filter list power does. And now I can run this, and I get the filtered list. And that's how to write clean and professional code in Python. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to follow along with this video series by subscribing and hitting the notification bell, or by clicking on the next video, so that you can expand your knowledge about Python. And as always, I can't wait to see you next time.